Hi everyone and welcome back to GameMaker Cast. It's Mickey, and in this video we're going to be creating the grid system that is going to handle the entire game for us. This video will probably be the longest and hopefully the most in-depth video that we will have. Setting up the grid will be the hardest part of the entire game, if you can imagine. We will be dealing with concepts like arrays and using the global variables that we created in the previous videos. So let's actually dive right in and take a quick look at what we actually have. We have an initial room, and then we just have our test room. In the initial room, we have one object just placed in there, and that object will handle the creation of the global variables for us. So what we want to do is, in our test room here, I'm going to actually just rename this to rm_game, and I will go into it and make sure I remove any creation code that I put in there. Now with that done, let's dive right in by creating a new object. The object that we're going to create is going to be called object_game_manager. Now this object is going to be in charge of not only drawing our grid, but actually handling the game itself. So I think this is a pretty fitting name. In this game manager, we're going to have three different events. We'll have a create event. Let's also have a step event, and we will have a draw event. In the create event, we're going to be using some of those global variables that we created in the initial room. So the first thing I need to do is I need to figure out how large our grid is going to be. So if we remember earlier in the videos, we decided that we were going to use an integer on the game difficulty. 1 being easy, 2 being medium, and 3 being hard. So using some simple math, I want the grid size to always be 3 times something. So 3 times 1 for easy will make a 3x3 grid. 3 times 2 for medium will be 6x6. And then 3 times 3, which will be hard, which will be a 9x9. So using this global variable, we can easily set in our create event the grid rows and grid columns based on that formula. So we could say global.grid underscore rows equals 3 times the global dot game difficulty. And we will do the same for the columns here. We'll say grid underscore columns equals 3 times the game difficulty. So in the end, what we could do is we could have a menu set up just where we choose easy, medium, and hard. And depending on which difficulty we choose, the global game difficulty will either be set to 1, 2, or 3, which then when our game loads up, we're going to be using this mathematical equation to figure out what kind of grid we need to draw. Alright, so now that we have the number of rows and the number of columns, we're going to have to initialize our 2D array. But first, let's take a quick break and let's talk about arrays. If you're not familiar with an array, then let's think of it this way. They're actually just a collection of numbers, strings, or really any other items that you can think of storing. A perfect example is if we were to load up something like Excel or a comma-separated value program, we could take a look at the default file. For example, if I were to load up Excel, we have a bunch of rows which go up and down, and a bunch of columns which go from the left to the right. Our 2D array is actually this entire table here. Within this table, on column 1, row 1, we're storing the number 0. On column 2, row 1, we'll have the number 1, 0, and so on and so on. So just think of a 2D array as a table. Now with that knowledge, we should be able to easily create the grid array in GameMaker. So let's switch back to GameMaker. And still in the create event, we will have 2 loops. We'll say for var row equals 0. And then while the row is less than the global.grid rows, we want to increase the row by 1. And we'll copy this because we're going to do the exact same for the column. So var col, or we could actually just say column. Oops, column, not columns. And then while the column is less than the grid underscore columns, we want to increase that column by 1. So all this for statement is doing is it's going row by row, which is up and down, and then left to right, and just basically going to initialize the array that we're going to create. And do we have it in our init object? Let's see here. We do not have it in here, which is fine. We are only going to put it in our game manager. So in here, we'll just say global dot grid underscore array. And now we have to pass in which row we are on, followed by which column. And we can say I random range between 0 and 1. So what this is going to do, depending on whatever our game difficulty is set to, it's going to then go up and down and left and right and either put a number 1 or a number 0 in that table. So if you remember the picture that we just looked at, it's going to build that for us. And now that we've created the array, we need some way to actually draw this on the screen. So I'm going to go to the draw event. And in here, we need a couple different things. Because our grid can be either 3x3, 6x6, or 9x9, I can't really go into my room game and then have my game manager, let's say if I place it in the middle, I can't use the X and Y coordinates of this object because even if I start right here, a 3x3 grid may be in the center, but a 6x6 grid will come all the way over to the right and further down, as well a 9x9 may even go off the screen. So I'm going to leave that object in there, but what we need to do is we need to use a little bit of math to find the middle of our room. So we could do this by just saying var position underscore x is going to be the room width divided by 2. So that's going to give us the middle of our room, meaning left and right. And we have to do the same for the y position, except instead of using width, let's actually use height. Now we need to figure out how tall and wide our grid is going to be. In the previous video, we set up this variable called grid spacing, and if you remember, that's going to be the space in between each of the blocks, meaning left, right, up, and down. So we can use this grid spacing to figure out how wide each block is, and then the number of rows and columns will give us how tall or how wide the entire grid is going to be. So that formula is actually pretty easy. We could say our position underscore x is going to minus equal, so this is going to take away from whatever we decide here. We will say global dot grid columns, and we're using columns because columns are left and right. So we want the number of columns that we have, and let's say we're using easy, so this will be 3 times the global dot grid spacing, so that would be 3 times 40, and then we want to divide that in half. And let's do the same for the y position. So we'll say position y is going to be grid underscore rows times the spacing divided in 2. So once again, we find the center of the room, and then we find the number of columns that we have left and right times the spacing. So if we were using easy, this would be 30 times 40, and then take that, 3 times 40, and then take that result of 120 and divide it in half, which will give us half of the grid that we are going to be drawing. And then all we're doing is taking that half away from the middle of the room that we already have. Okay, so our math is actually almost done here. We have one more thing that we need to do. We need to actually draw this grid on the screen. And to do that, we can just easily go back to our create statement, and we can grab the 2 for statements here. Let's copy them and go to the draw event, and let's just paste them in. Now, we don't need to set anything to this grid here, so we can delete that. What we need to do is we need to grab the current position, we need to make up the current position based on whatever row and column we are on, and then we need to add the spacing into that position. So I will just say underscore x equals the position x, so this is going to be where we start, plus the column that we are on, so this will be 0, 1, 2, or 3, or depending how many we have. So x equals our starting position plus the column that we are on times the global.grid spacing. So this will be position x, and let's say the position is 100. the column could be 0 times spacing. So 0 times whatever is 0. So the first position would be 100, and then the next position would be 1. So we would move x over 1 times 40, which is 40. So we would add 40 onto our position x, and we would just keep going to the right, and then once we hit the number of columns, we would move down 1 row. So let's actually do the same with the y. Obviously, we'll change everything to position y and change it to the current row that we are on. Now we can draw the actual rectangle. So we'll say draw underscore rectangle, and it takes 4 coordinates. So the position x, the position y, and then now all we have to do is say x plus global dot grid spacing and y plus global dot grid spacing. So we're just adding our grid spacing on to the left and to the top, and we want it to be outlined. Okay, now let's see here. I think that's pretty good. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to try and run the game and see what our grid looks like, or see if we have any errors before we move forward. Now you can see that our game is now running. We have a 3x3 grid, and it is directly in the center. Let me actually go to the object in it and change it to medium, and let's run our game again just to make sure that the grid is going to be in the center of the screen. And you can see that it is, so we're going to have no problem with this here. I'm going to switch that back to 1, and the only real thing that I'm going to do here is after we draw the rectangle, let's actually just say draw underscore text, because we want to draw the value, or I want to show you the value of our array. So I'll say draw text at the x and the y position that we're making up, and I want to use the global dot grid array, and in there I want to use the row and the column that we are on. And I guess that is col, not column. All right, so let me just make sure that I have everything here spelled correctly. And if I hit F5, we should have a 3x3 grid and a bunch of random numbers in there. Now the one thing that you might notice, if I close this and I hit F5 and I run it again, let's see if all those columns at the top are 1s, and they are. So this isn't truly random, and that's because we're using the same seed every time. What I want to do, or an easy way around this, we need to call randomize at the start of the game. So in our room init, we can easily we could do it in 2 different places. We could do it in the object init, or we could do it in the creation code. Let's actually put it in the object init. So at the very top in the create event, we'll just say randomize, and that's all we have to do. So if we hit F5 again, our game should load up, and you can see that now it is different. And just like before, if we set it to hard mode, we'll have the grid in the center. You can see that we have all the different numbers here, all the different spaces are filled in. I think really the only thing I can do in this video next will be just to actually add the sprites in. Let's actually do that pretty quickly because it's extremely easy to do. I'll leave that on hard just so we can see. And what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 sprites here. We'll call SPR light on, and we need to import an image, and I will just use the SPR light on, and I'm going to set my anchor point to the center, and I will duplicate this and turn it to light off and import the light off, and I'll leave it in the center. I'll close this, and I think I already closed this one. So now that we have our 2 sprites in there, we close our init object. In here, instead of drawing the text, we're going to call a script, and that script is going to check the row and column that we're asking it to, and then either draw the light on or the light off. So to do this, we'll create a script. We'll call it SCR underscore draw light. I'll make sure that I name this properly, draw capital light. So we have a couple of different arguments. We need the row and column that we're in, and then the position to draw it in, which is the X and Y position. So we could say specified row equals argument 0, and I'm going to copy this. The specified column that we're asking for is argument 1. We could say var the x position is argument 2, and then the y position is argument 3. So these are all the arguments that we're going to pass in, and then we could just use a simple if statement to check to see if that grid array has a 0 or a 1. So we could say if global.grid array at the specified row and the specified column equals 0, then what we want to do is draw a sprite, and we want to draw spr underscore light off. We do not have any sub images, so we'll say 0, and we want to draw it at the x position and at the y position that we pass in. I'll make this a tiny bit bigger here. And the next thing we need to do is just a simple else, because instead of drawing a light off, let's draw a light on. Now all we have to do is call this script instead of the draw text by passing in these same parameters here. So we could say scr underscore draw light, and you can see it takes a specified row and column, which are our variables here, row, column, at the x position and that y position. Now as long as I didn't hit any other keys here, I should be able to comment out this draw text, and if I hit F5, let's see here, we should get a grid and some lights being on or off. Now you can see that everything is centered, so the easy fix for this actually is to go up here and put my anchor back at the top left. Let's actually do that. And I'll explain why I'm doing that once I run the game, just to verify that everything is working. You can see that everything is indeed working. Maybe what we want to do is pad this a little bit. Actually, let's see here. Let's do some live coding. Let's go to the middle center of each one, and in the draw light, we'll say var sprite padding is going to be equal to, and our light, we have 32 by 32, so we want 16. So half of 32 is 16 because we want to move it to the left and to the top by 16. So we'll do the x position plus the sprite padding on each one, and then the y position, if I remember correctly, it should also be plus the sprite padding. So we're going to move it down and we're going to move it to the right. Let's see if this worked. Let's move it a little bit more, and this is where you kind of get to fool around with things. 18 might not be enough. We might actually put that at 20. And if we think about it, if we change that to 20, as long as our grid padding is going to be bigger than our grid sprite, we can easily say global.grid spacing, divide it in half, because our grid spacing is set to 40, divide it in half is set to 20. And we should get that same thing. Now, the test for this is if we actually go into our inner object, and let's change this to 64. Let's see, this may go off the screen, not 100% sure, but you can see that the lights here, they are centered correctly. You can see that it went up and down off the screen because we don't have the window size set correctly, which is 100% fine. So we'll set that back at 40, we'll set that game difficulty at 1, and if we run one more time, we should see that our game is pretty close here. Now all we have to do, and this was coming up in the next video, is work on the clicking, and once we click on something, we'll have to check to see if all of the lights are turned off. And I'll give you a little hint before we actually go into that tutorial, because all you're really doing is you're going to be checking each row and each column to see if at that specific grid item is equal to 1, meaning that the light is turned on according to our light script here on this else statement. So if that current grid item at the row and column is equal to 1, the light is turned on, and you know that you have not won the game. So that's just a little bit of a hint if you wanted to try it yourself. I'll just clean up this code, and I think this video is done now. I'd like to thank you for watching this series. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon. A shout out to Matt and Paul. If you found this video useful or any other video that I have, please show some support by subscribing or liking the video. Once again, thank you.